Hi, sixth graders. This is Mrs. Gall. Today we're going to talk about landmarks, which would be measures of central tendency and measures of variation. Go ahead and get your notebook open to a fresh page and get this title at the top. Press play when you're ready to continue. Our first landmarks we're going to talk through are measures of central tendency. Some things to know about measures of central tendency is they're used to describe the center of our data, and all of these can be considered averages. Our mean is when we add up all of the numbers and divide by the number of data points that there are. A lot of times people connect the mean with the average, but it's not the only landmark that can be used as an average. Our second measure of central tendency is our median. This is where we order the data from least to greatest and then find the middle number, or if it's an even set of data, the middle of the two middle numbers. Our last measure of central tendency is the mode. Mode occurs most often. There could be one mode in your data, more than one mode, or no mode at all. Pause the video to get those definitions written down. Measures of variation describe the distribution of the data, which is how far spread out the data is. We do not consider any of these averages. Our maximum, or abbreviated as max, is our largest number in the data. Our minimum is our smallest number in the data. And our range is when we subtract the maximum and the minimum. Pause if you need more time to write those. Let's practice finding those landmarks. The first thing we want to do is take our data and order it from least to greatest. Notice we have some negatives in this data set where we're looking at low temperatures in degrees Fahrenheit. So let's start by ordering this from least to greatest. I know my data is going to start with -11 because that's my smallest negative number. It's then going to go to -9, -4, 2, 5, and 6. Sometimes it's helpful if you cross off the numbers as you're writing them in order from least to greatest, especially if you're doing this on paper or electronically, just to make sure you have all the data accounted for. Now let's find those landmarks we talked about. To find the mean, we're going to add up all of our data and divide by how many data points there are. I think all my answers are going to release right away, so I'm just going to write these out and then we'll check our answers at the end. So to find the mean, I'm going to take -11, add it to -9, add that to -4, plus 2, plus 5, plus 6. When I'm adding those together, I'm getting -11. I'm just going to double check that one time to make sure I added correctly. Okay, I'm getting -11 when I add those 6 numbers. So now I'm going to take -11 and divide it by 6. That's how many data points there are. And I'm getting -1.83 repeating, so I will just round that to -1.83. Next, let's go on to our median, which is our middle number. One way I like to remember that median is the middle is if you're driving in a car or riding in a car, the piece of land that is in the center of the road, sometimes it's just cement, sometimes there's grass and trees on it, that's called the median. It's in the middle of the road. So our median is the middle of our numbers. So in order to find the exact middle, I really encourage you to use some type of marking to help figure out the center. So I like to mark off low, high, and I keep doing that until I get down to 1 or 2 numbers. I need to make sure the same set is marked off on the same side. I don't want 3 marked off on the left and 2 marked off on the right. So I notice after I mark off 2 on each side, I came down to 2 numbers. What's in the middle of -4 and +2? That's going to be our median. So how do I figure that out? Well, maybe I could just visualize what's right in the middle. For me, since I'm working with some negatives and some positives, I prefer to add the two together. So I'm going to add -4 plus 2, and that gives me -2. And then I divide by 2 because that's how many numbers I'm working with. And that will tell me the exact center of those two numbers. I know -2 divided by 2 is -1, so my median is -1. So the process I just used was basically finding the mean of the middle two numbers. I added them together and divided by 2, and that will tell me the exact center of the data. Oops. Let's move on to mode. Mode is our number that occurs the most. Do I have any numbers that are there more than the others? No, there are no numbers that repeat at all. So in this case, we would say none or no mode. We want to avoid using the number 0 because 0 is a number. And so if we put 0 here, 0 mode, that might confuse someone and they might think you have a lot of zeros in your data set, which is not true. Let's move on to range. To find the range, you need the max and the min because we're going to subtract those. So this will allow us to find the max and the min as well as the range. What's my max in this data set? My largest number is 6. My min in this data set, my smallest number, is -11. So now I'm going to subtract 6 minus a -11. I get 17. That's how far apart my largest and my smallest numbers are. If you need help plugging in negatives on a calculator, check in with your teacher, but if you're on a TI-30, next to the equal sign to the left is a negative sign, and you can apply that to all of these numbers as you're plugging them into your calculator. Let's see how our answers aligned. Mean was -1.83, median was -1, no mode, range of 17. Looks like we did a good job. Let's move on to three other types of measures of variation. The lower quartile, sometimes referred to as LQ or Q1, is the median of the lower half of the data. Which means if we have a lower quartile, we also have an upper quartile, which is the median of the upper half of the data. Sometimes we refer to that as UQ or Q3 because it's the third quarter of the data. And then once we have those quartiles, we can also find something called the interquartile range, which we often refer to as IQR. That's when you subtract your upper quartile and your lower quartile. Kind of like the range, except for instead of max minus min, we subtract upper and lower quartiles. Please pause to write those down. Press play when you're ready to continue. Before we get started, let's talk a little bit about an outlier. So an outlier is a data point that is much larger or much smaller than the other data points. It's kind of like a number that just doesn't really belong with the rest. Pause if you need more time to write that down. Let's practice finding all of those landmarks, including the upper and lower quartiles, our new landmarks. So these are Charlie's scores. We're going to go ahead and order these from least to greatest before we get started. My smallest score is 74. Then it looks like she has 2 78s. I'm sorry, 85. 85. 90, 91, and 92. Let's start by finding the mean. Why don't you pause to find the mean? I'm going to find it as well. Press play when you're ready to hear the answer. Remember, for the mean, you're adding these up and dividing by how many numbers there are. When I add these numbers together, I get 673, and there are 8 numbers in the data set. So I'm going to take 673 divided by 8. I get a mean of 84.125. You could just round that to 84.1 if you wanted to, or you can keep all 3 numbers. Next, let's find the median. To find the median, I'm going to cross off low, high to find the center of the center two numbers. You can pause now and try that on your own. Press play when you're ready to see me walk through it. My median, I came down to 285s. If I came down to 285s, what's right in the middle? Just 85. I could also add those together and divide by 2. That will also give me 85. Let's move on to mode. Mode is which numbers occur the most. Remember, you can have no mode, one mode, or more than one mode. What do you notice about this data set? Maybe you notice that 78 is in there twice and 85 is in there twice. That means we have two modes in this data set. So we just want to write both of those down, 78 and 85. Those are our two modes. We do not average them. My range. My range is going to be my maximum minus my minimum. My data is already ordered, so it's easy to spot the max and the min. The max is 92, the min is 74. I subtract those to get 18. Now let's move on to our upper and lower quartiles. Those are our newer landmarks. Let's start with LQ. The lower quartile is going to be the median of the lower half of the data. Look at where you drew your line for your median. You're going to look at everything below that line for the lower quartile. So if I'm looking at everything below that line, I'm going to find the median of these four numbers. So I'm going to cross off low, high, and I'm already down to 2 in the center. So if I'm down to a 78 and a 78, what must my lower quartile be? It must be 78. If those were two different numbers, I could add them together and divide by 2 to figure out what that lower quartile is. Let's try the upper quartile. Same process, but we're going to look at everything above the median line. So everything above the median line, there are 4 numbers. If I cross off low, high, I come down to 90 and 91. What's right in the middle of 90 and 91? 90 and a half. I could have added those together and divided by 2, and that would give me the same thing. My last landmark is my IQR, my interquartile range. That's where I subtract my upper quartile minus my lower quartile. I'm going to use my calculator now to figure out what my IQR is. I'm getting 12 and a half. Let's quickly work through one more example. If you'd like to try this one on your own, you absolutely can. These are our high temperatures in a week. Making sure that wasn't the same. If you want to pause the video, I'm going to move through the answers fairly quickly, so go ahead and pause now while you try it. Press play when you're ready to see the answers. You're finding mean, median, mode, range, upper quartile, lower quartile, and interquartile range. All right, you guys, let's go through those answers. So your mean was 82.9, your median was 83, should have come down to one number in the center. Your mode was none, your range was 17. Let's look at that lower and upper quartile. One thing to note, maybe you didn't get these correct, so let's talk about it. We came down to just 83 in the center. Notice I put a box around it. That 83 is off limits. We haven't really talked about that when there's one number in the center, finding that lower and upper quartile. So if you got these wrong, just listen carefully. So when my median's 83, I'm not going to include it when I'm looking for my lower and upper quartile. So I'm going to look at everything below the box for the lower quartile and everything above the box for the upper quartile. So let's start with that lower quartile. Look at everything below your median. You have 3 numbers. What's your center of those 3? 76. So that's my lower quartile. Now let's look at everything above that box for my upper quartile. You're not going to include that median. You're just going to look at the 3 numbers above it. The center of those 3 numbers is 89. So that's my upper quartile. So again, on the last example, we came down to the median being in the center of two numbers, so we drew that line, and then we got to look at everything below the line and above the line. But on this example, our median came down to one number, so we look at everything below that number and above that number for the upper and lower quartiles. Remember, our IQR is when we subtract those two, so we take 89 minus 76 to get 13. That's all I have for you today with landmarks. You guys check in with your teacher if you have any other questions.